not here, but the one who speaks just right after you is not online yet.
Oh, I see.
Uma tela que eu não sinto do link to the bios. Oh my God.
I think we have that on the screen. So we can kind of move a little bit. So
Yeah, that's what I'm
because
thinking too. Yeah, I think so.
I saw the picture of us, yeah, spread a little bit. Tava naquela programação, tem o bio.
Eu achei. Can I? What are you? Okay, I got it.
We're making it COVID friendly.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming to this session. This is the first session of Subsem 3, the Green Pathway to Growth and Sustainability. I have the pleasure to present this session, Managing Forests for the SDGs, Creating Value, Equality, and Resilience from Forest Products and Ecosystem Services. This session will open with Mr. Garo Batmanian, lead of the forest practice of the World Bank, and he will deliver a keynote speech for us today. So, Garo, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Thais. Thank you. Good afternoon for those that are here. Good morning. Good evening for those that are connecting online. I hope a lot of people also connecting online. This is an interesting thing to do. I'm asked to give a keynote speech, which I think is more of a setting the context so that we know where we're going on. What we all know when we talk about SDG, we tend to focus more on SDG 15. That is the SDG that we think is ours in the area of forests. It says, goal 15, life of land, protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems. Combat desertification, manage forests, reverse land degradation. So protect, restore, and promote sustainable use. Keep those three action verbs on your head. The point that I'm going to make here for the next 10 minutes or so is that, as you heard this morning, and is the goal of this conference, we, the forest sector or forests in general, contribute to many more SDGs, and not only in this one. So if we take a look at how we have the SDGs and organized on biosphere, on society, social, and on economics, we have at least, or directly linked, at least 8 SDGs out of all that we have. 8. I know there are indirect ones as well, but I'm going to just focus on the 8 ones so they don't think that we are pushing and trying to patch our numbers, okay? But only these 8 are already big. And I'm going to go over them to you so that you can think about, we see how we can do this. But remember, protect, restore, manage, right? So to end poverty, target 1.5, it says that we have to reduce exposure and vulnerability to climate-related extreme events. Well, forest fires are increasing because of climate change. We do have landslides. We do have problem with flooding. A lot of those activities, which are extreme events, are in fact either triggered by deforestation or can be prevented by reforestation, restoration, or better forest management to prevent increasing forest fires. So it's clearly here that there is a role for forests. You go to the next one, and hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture. Here too, is clear mention to forests when we say that we have to maintain ecosystems, the strength capacity to adapt, to strengthen the capacity for adaptation to climate change. And I want to point out the other one, which is maintain the genetic diversity of seeds of wild species. When we manage a forest properly, when we conserve the forest, remember, promote, protect, restore, manage. If we manage properly or protect properly, we are also protecting the wild species. This is where most of our nurseries come from. We do identify the trees, or we can identify the trees, the main trees that can produce seeds. We go to the next one, clean water and sanitation. The goal is to ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. Now, you come to target 6.6, again, it's clear. Protect and restore water-related ecosystems, including mountains and forests. I don't have to tell you how important is forests to maintain the watershed, the quality and quantity of water. So again, it's promote, restore, or manage. Now, you go to the next one that I selected to discuss here today is promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. Something that I know is dear to Thais when we're talking about value chains and all the work we have to do to ensure proper integration of the indigenous people and the local communities. You say here that it's clear that we have to talk about sustainable consumption. Yes, we have to decrease the consumption and organize our consumption, but he also talks about sustainable production. And this is something that where sustainable forest management, good forestry fits. Also, there is a goal of promoting sustainable tourism. Quite often, I think all of you will have agreed that nature tourism is not necessarily sustainable tourism. And it doesn't happen on itself if we don't work on it, especially in the areas that we have forest areas. People go there, go over carrying capacity of the area, end up degrading the forest, which affects all the other ones that we just heard. Continuing, come to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Well, one goal is to maintain natural heritage, world's natural heritage. That's our forests, the important forests around, in and around the landscape where villages or cities are. The second part of it is environmental links between urban, peri-urban, and rural areas. Thais and I happen to come from a city in Rio de Janeiro where they planted the forest in the middle of Rio de Janeiro to maintain, in Brazil, to ensure that the water supply for the city was maintained after it was a coffee plantation. That area now is a national park, and most of you have seen because on top of it there is a Christ the Redeemer in it. So this was 19th century. We're already looking at environmental links between urban, peri-urban, and rural areas. And of course, we go back to ensuring sustainable consumption and production patterns. Is basically the same, is a variation of the previous topic, sustainable management and efficient use of natural resources. I put here that, mangroves are part of our forests as well. We have to think about it. Not everything is on the land. So I gave that picture a little bit of a different view so that we can think about it, but also that we have to consider monitoring sustainable development impacts from tourism. I just talked about it and how this is important. So we're now already in 12. We come to 13. That's what we heard more. That's what we talk more about, is the climate change. And the climate change has strengthened resilient and adaptive capacity to climate-related hazards, and then there's integrate climate change measures into national policies. In both cases, it's forests. What is not saying here, but is the mitigation part. There are two pieces of information that came out lately that I think is important to consider when we're talking about climate change. The first one, the IPCC report of 2019, concluded that all assessed models all asset models for pathways to achieve 1.5 degrees, to maintain it at 1.5 degrees. All the models and all the pathways modeled had a combination of reforestation, protection, and afforestation. The amount of each one of them vary a little bit, but that's all of it. So you can't achieve 1.5 degrees without dealing with forests, not forestry, forest sector, but forests in general. The second piece of information that I think is important is the IPBS, the equivalent of, let's say, the equivalent of IPCC for the Biodiversity Convention. In the 2019 report, they concluded that 37% of the mitigation necessary to achieve 2 degrees, 37%, can be achieved with nature-based solutions, which also generate biodiversity co-benefits. What is nature-based solutions? Most of them is either protecting forests or restoring forests. So again, we have the climate change. But I wanted to show here is that it's much more than climate change. So we are back to the green agenda and the SDGs and the life of land, which was the first one I showed you. My question is, the point that I'm making here is that there is, the links are there, but they don't only happen by themselves. What I think is missing, and that's what we're going to see the discussion here today, is that we need to work we need to do work to make this happen. It's just not happen on itself. And I pointed out I put out 5 topics which I think are important for us in order to consider if we want forests to really deliver on all SDGs. The first one is to increase collaboration with other sectors to properly consider forests in their policies and programs, including nature-based solutions. We can help on disaster risk management. We have to talk with agriculture people. Maybe we have to talk with health people. We have to talk with urban people, but we have to talk with them. Just expect them they're going to do the right thing without collaborating and trying to have this done is not going to happen. The second one is promote a landscape approach. What I tried to say here, and after 30 years working on this, is that we can make the forest work, but economically, but forest is a type of land use. Even protection is a type of land use. You made a decision to keep it as forest. But there is always a trade-off. And then the people making economic decisions about land use, they're always going to look at trade-offs. So if we adopt a landscape approach, instead of just saying forest is always better than agriculture or something like that, you heard today the Director General of FAO saying, well, if depending on how much water is, how much rainfall it is, some places should be forest, some places is advantage to have other land use. So if we adopt a landscape approach, forest and restoration are land uses and trades, and trade-offs can and should be calculated. However, we should insist that the trade-offs are calculated including natural capital, because right now the trade-offs are for 5-year, 10-year economic span, not necessarily a long-term view. All these other aspects on water, on climate, on people, on hunger, those are not built in because they're not looking at natural capital. The third point I want to make is that we have to, of course, continue to develop and disseminate new technologies. We do know a lot, but we need to keep learning and producing knowledge and disseminating it because the world is changing, so socioeconomically and also because of climate change. And we need to make those areas more resilient. We need more technology. We need new science to work in it. The fourth point, which I think we're going to discuss today as well, is that we need to improve documenting and monitoring and reporting the ecosystem services we provide. Sometimes we have a very well-managed forest, is FSC certified, but we don't tell and we don't measure, we don't estimate how much is helping biodiversity, water services, other services, ecosystem services provided by that area. That doesn't help us explain that forest is something that's important for all SDGs, because people don't see the entire value of the forest. And this also precludes some investment from coming in, which leads me to the final point. We need to develop financial mechanisms that are adapted. First of all, they are adapted to the time frame of sustainable projects. If I'm going to do a forest management project in tropical areas, take 2 years to plan, first year to harvest, and you're only harvesting 1/3 of the entire area, you can't start paying your debt after your loan after the first year. You need a 5-year grace period, and you probably need 10 years for you to pay off the debt. So the terms are not very good. That is one issue from the commercial side. But if we do the other ones that I explained above, that we can document, monitor, and report ecosystem services, we should be able to work to develop better recognition on carbon markets, on payment for environmental services, from REDD+, which maybe they don't make it enough to make something profitable, but the experience showed that if it's marginally profitable, this payment for environmental services, the extra carbon credit, okay? I can explain that later, but, or the REDD programs are enough to increase the profit to the level that the margin of profit to make it really profitable on the long term. And that's a difference that we have to, those tools out there, some of them are going to hear today, but I hope that we consider these five topics as the starting point of how we proactively work to get forests to really deliver on all the SDGs that we can for. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Garo, for the very good speech, addressing, I think, very interesting points about the comprehensive contribution of forests to the SDGs, and also for the timekeeping. I would like to invite our next speakers. Our next speakers are going to present remotely. We have Dr. Yanshu Lee, Forest and Economics and Taxation Outreach Specialist, and Richard Bin May, Hargreaves Professor of Forest Finance, both from the Warnow School of Forestry and Natural Resources of the University of Georgia in the US. This is a selected paper by the Congress, and the name of the paper is Assessing the Contributions and Linkage of the Forest Sector to the National Economy, Case Studies on Finland, Malawi, and the United States of America. Thank you.
The opportunity to share with you our work. Today, I will give you a brief introduction of the paper. Richard, Thais, and Natalia, please chime in if I missed anything. The paper is one of the outputs of a recent project we conducted for FAO. As we all know, forest and the forest sector can make contributions to national economy and the multiple SDGs. And the enhancing forest sector is actually included in many countries' national development strategy and the national forest strategy. However, in many cases, the starting point question facing many stakeholders is exactly how much does the forest sector contribute to national economy? And another related question is, how does it work? How does the forest sector make contribution to national economy? Our study is trying to answer those two questions using 3 country case studies, specifically Finland, Malawi, and the USA. And the study is closely related to SDG 8, economic growth and decent work, and also touches many other SDGs because forest sector, forest industries very often located in rural areas. So for each country case study, there are 2 major blocks. The first block is to estimate the total economic contribution of the forest sector to its national economy. And the second block is to quantify, identify, and quantify the sectoral linkages of the forest sector to other sectors in the economy. And the most previous assessment of economic contribution often use the forest sector's direct value-added employment or labor income to measure its impact to national economy. However, the forest sector make contribution to national economy not only through direct impacts, direct employment, for example, but also through indirect impacts. For example, a sawmill may purchase equipment and machineries from manufacturing company, and also through the induced effects. For example, the employees of the sawmill and also the machinery manufacturing companies, they have local household spending, and those triggers additional rounds of impacts in the economy. So it's very important to take the multiplier effects into consideration and look at its total contribution to the economy. And furthermore, we zoom in and analyze the major pathways or linkages of how the forest sector's influences are transmitted through other sectors in the economy. We use the input-output model for each country and also use a structural path analysis approach to identify the major pathways. Due to time limitations, we are not able to share with you all the details of the results and the findings today. If you're interested, you may find a short version of the report in the proceedings, and you are welcome to send us your comments and the concerns. Here I summarize a few major findings from the report. First, the forest sector has a great potential to make contribution to the national economy. And in all three countries, the forest sector's direct, indirect, and induced effects are actually higher than its direct effects in terms of employment, value added, and the labor income for the studied year. And the wood-based processing industries have higher economic multipliers than the forestry and the logging industries. This has important policy implications. And there are similarities in forest sector's top linked sectors among those three countries. For example, the construction sector is one of the major top forward-linked sectors for all three countries. And the demand from the construction sector actually triggers the demand for forest sector. And there are great variations exist in sectoral linkage path among those three countries. And the difference came from stage of development, resource endowments, forest ownership, the position in international trade, and also national forest policy. The results can advance our understanding of the sectoral linkages of forest sector in national economy and also provide thoughts on how to weave the forest sector into national development strategies in a holistic way. Thank you for having me here today. Thank you.
Good idea.
Thank you, Yanshu, for the timekeeping as well and the great presentation. Our next speaker is Ms. Jade Quetzal Nava Cardenas from the Universidad Autónoma Chapingo in Mexico. However, I was informed she's not yet online. So I'm moving straight to the next speaker, who is Mr. Benjamin Firewood from the Faculty of Forestry, University of Toronto in Canada. And he's going to present on the forest sector development pathways. Thank you. Mr. Benjamin.
Hi, everyone. This is a pre-recorded presentation, so apologies if it sounds a little odd. History suggests that not all countries follow the same forest sector development path, and not all development paths are equally desirable. Understanding the differences in forest sector development is consequently vital to achieving green growth in forested landscapes. but empirical work in this subject is very, very scarce. When one examines global forestry, it's striking that the distribution of development outcomes is both variable and sticky. And by sticky, I mean that countries with underdeveloped sectors seem to remain underdeveloped throughout time. So consider here this Lorenz curve for forestry. This figure is comparing the share of economic benefit accruing to countries to the share of wood production. The 45-degree line is the line of equality. So if all countries received economic gains in the same proportion to the raw materials production, they would all fall in this 45-degree line. The distance for the line tells you something about how unequal the global distribution of economic benefits is. Countries on the bottom left are receiving a lower share of economic benefit relative to the raw materials output, and countries on the top right are receiving a higher share. When you think about the economic history of these countries, it's really striking that some of those countries on the bottom left, like Estonia and Latvia and Russia, have low value-added industries. After hundreds of years of development, they haven't climbed up the value chain. Similarly, countries on the top right, like Germany, that were historically important sources of innovation and value-added products, remain in this enviable position. Here, to measure economic benefits, we're using a global input-output database, the World Input-Output Database. And this allows us to calculate both the direct and the direct economic gains from forest products consumption anywhere in the world. If you're interested in this sort of analysis, I see there's a side event tomorrow on land footprints that you should check out. But of course, contribution to GDP is just one way to measure development. And in the supporting paper of this presentation, we present a different approach. So what we do is we classify countries into different types of development pathway. And the idea here is that if we can identify the dimensions on which development varies, then we can score countries in those dimensions, and we can treat this as an unsupervised classification problem. So essentially what we're doing is seeing what forms of development have evolved over time. We did this with 82 countries, and here you're seeing just the 55 that have complete data. And our analysis identified 4 groups, or 4 different types of forest sector development with names as per the figure. And these different types are identified based on variation in a set of fundamental economic and ecological variables. The details in the paper, so just to focus on the important sources of variation, when you project these countries on the first 2 principal components, you see that the types are identified based on variation in the fraction of primary forest cover remaining, the accessibility of that resource, specialization of raw products exports, that's dimension 1. Dimension 2 is adding in specialization of value-added paper and paper products and the fraction under management. And countries are also being scored on the production from planted forests and the output per area cut as retrieved from satellite data and wood products exports. These results are a little surprising. I'm a Canadian and I don't usually think of Canada's forest sector as being that comparable to Congo DRC's. But these results suggest that in terms of these fundamental variables, it's actually quite similar. And of course we could discuss variable selection. But there's 2 ideas here that I want to highlight. First is that there's really no reason to think about a single global development trajectory. Different trajectories for different countries are very important for thinking about things ranging from industrial policy to carbon finance baselines. And second, we can think about development as countries evolving into different sort of niches and start asking questions about how countries move within or between niches over time. So up to this point, the work is all in the accompanying paper, but I'd like to tell you briefly about some ongoing work that builds on these results. So today I presented 2 different measures of development in forestry, value chain income and this multidimensional typology. But why do different countries take different development paths? What explains the distribution of development across countries in the world? So we can study this econometrically. And in some ongoing research, I've tested conventional explanations for the distribution of development outcomes, things like comparative advantage, alongside an indicator of path dependency in development. And here I'm using the start date of higher education and forestry. If anyone's interested in that, I've built a database and I would be very keen to get input or share that. So it turns out that when you do cross-country regressions, the start date of higher education forestry is a significant predictor of variation in development outcomes, even when conventional explanations are included and various controls are put in. This is important because it shows that history matters in development. And I know that might seem like an obvious idea, but providing sound evidence to substantiate it matters for policymaking. Path dependency implies that there's limits on the room to maneuver for countries that want to develop their forest product sector. Past pathways may be closed. It leads to questions like, does a given development policy just wind up benefiting already rich countries more? Is it possible for poorer countries to break out of a dependency trap and reap equitable rewards from exploiting their sovereign forest resources? Is it possible for emerging economies to learn from the experiences of those that have gone before, or are their development paths just fundamentally different? And so on. But in the interest of time, we'll stop there and say a big thank you to the conference organizers for inviting me, and I hope you all have a rewarding and fun conference.
Thank you, Benjamin, for a very interesting paper and innovative methodology. So now I would like to move to a presentation in presence. I would like to invite Paula Sarella Pozzo Inofuentes from the Tunen Institute of Forestry from Germany, and she will present the paper Monitoring the Sustainability Effects of Bioeconomy Beyond Black and White Perspectives, the Forest Sector in Uruguay. Paula, please.
Thank you, Thais, for the introduction. Well, now I wanted to talk about the contribution of the forest-based bioeconomy to the different sustainability effects, going beyond economy and also including other environmental and social aspects, with a special focus on the forest sector in Uruguay. So what are you going to see now is I'm going to give you a brief introduction of how do we measure bioeconomy. This application of the methodology, particularly to the cellulose value chain in Uruguay as a case study, and followed by different sustainability impacts that we assessed, and also establishing the links of those impacts to the SDGs, and finally with some general remarks. So how do we quantify forest-based bioeconomy? At the Tunen Institute, we used an approach that was developed by the same institute, which is a material flow approach. Basically, it's a combination of a life cycle assessment and material flow analysis. And what we do is we departure from the point that sustainability, or in other words, bioeconomy is not always more sustainable and doesn't always create win-win in all the sustainability dimensions. And therefore, assessing bioeconomy also implies assessing the sustainability of the bioeconomy. And our approach is that we include different sustainability indicators from the environment, economy, and society perspectives. We combine this with a biomass flow analysis along the value chain from harvesting to all the processing and manufacturing steps until the end use. And we link those steps to different sustainability impacts. At the end, also, we link those with what is the contribution of those to the SDGs. So now going into the case study of Uruguay, for those that don't know, Uruguay is a small country that's in south of South America, and small in terms of territory, but has a big connection to the global bioeconomy, especially when we talk about agriculture and forestry. In terms of forestry, it's a big producer of cellulose pulp. And on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, you could see this material flow analysis that's based on the biomass, and you could see that the majority of the extracted wood goes to the elaboration of cellulose, and also this cellulose is exported almost in total, so 99.6% is exported. And our question was, what are the sustainability effects that are linked to those, to this value chain? So what we did, so we assessed different sustainability indicators using official statistics, but also combined with empirical studies. Here I will just show you an example of 3 that are also globally important, and I try to include socioeconomic and environmental. So we talk about employment, value added, and also greenhouse gas emissions. And in terms of employment, you could see here the different steps of the value chain and how every step of the value chain contributes to employment. And you could see that in the, for example, in the green colors, belong to the primary phase, which is more silvicultural activities and wood extraction. And the majority of the employment is generated in this stage, and actually there is a lower contribution of employment when we talk about the industry. But you have the opposite pattern if we talk about value added. So most of the value added is generated in the industry level, and the primary phase is rather lower. And in terms of greenhouse gas emissions also, majority is generated in the industry level, and the primary stage contributes also a lot lower, around 10% to the total greenhouse gas emissions of this value chain. And I also put here and established the links with the SDGs and beyond highlighting the different trade-offs that are in the different sustainability objectives, also as linked to what Garo said, like forests contribute more than the SDG 15, so there are other SDGs that are also linked to forests, and in this particular case, with these 3 examples. So, and some general remarks, as I say, sustainability, the assessing of the sustainability impacts of forest-based value chains, it's complex and requires an holistic approach, and this material flow approach allows the quantification and monitoring in the 3 dimensions of sustainability, and also establishing the links with the SDGs. Also, as we could see in these examples, there are different trade-offs and synergies between different sustainability objectives. But although those are unavoidable, it's important to identify them in order to either reduce when there are trade-offs or to be maximized when there are benefits. And we could see also that monitoring and evaluation of forest-based bioeconomy along the value chain has opportunities to be coupled with SDGs, especially when we're talking about the SDG 8, 12, 13, and 15. And with this, I wanted to finish. I want to thank all the institutions that help us, also the funding body, and if you have further questions beyond the session, my contact details. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paula. And with Paula's presentation, we finished the first module of this session, which was to present the reports, the articles which were selected by the World Forest Congress. And I would like to open the floor. We have 5 minutes for questions. I think we had very interesting examples here on the different contributions from forest to the SDGs. Yes, Amos, please. Can you go to the mic just at the center of the room?
Thank you very much. I am Amos Amanubo, and thank you for those wonderful insights into the contribution of forest. This morning, during the launch of the SOFO, it was highlighted that agriculture continues to be a threat to forestry, I think mainly because of food, providing food and feeding the masses. But a lot has been highlighted about the value of forests and how it contributes. A lot usually circles around the wood-based resources. I would like to know how we can unlock the potential of forests in terms of contributing to the food-based non-timber forest products. Thank you very much.
Do you direct your question to anyone in particular?
I direct my question to Paolo, since she also highlighted the bioeconomy. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Paula, please.
Yeah.
Hola, okay. So if I understand your question is how we could support the use of forests for wood products.
Food.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about bioeconomy, we're talking about different wood and non-wood products. And we are focusing currently in wood-based value chains, and this is true. There are also not only a lot of current products, but also there are a lot of potential products when we talk about wood-based value chains. But forests are also important beyond wood. No, they provide a big variety on non-timber forest products that also have a lot of potential. In my opinion, still very not like very little discovered, not of the huge potential that they represent. And in terms of also food, there are many other potentials products that could be generated. And I think it's important to consider forests as a complex, as I say, no, going beyond wood and taking the trees as all the potentials that they have other also including ecosystem services.
Thank you, Paula. We have time for one more question. I don't see any hands, so we can, yes? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Dietrich Dahr from Rhein-Waal University in Germany. I would like to have a question to Garo. In your presentation, you referred to additional carbon funding, and I wanted to elaborate on this a little bit.
The question is directed to? Yes.
It's not turning.
I think it is on.
It's on? Okay. There are some initiatives out there that are looking what we're calling carbon plus. If you are investing in carbon in an area that also maintains biodiversity and other ecosystem services, you can quantify. There is a discussion of developing bonds or other tools that charge more for that hectare than only the ton of carbon that you are protecting as a sink or you are accumulating. Instead of compare, so that you take into account the quality of the area that you are buying the carbon from, not only the carbon itself. So a plantation of a monoculture of an exotic species in a tropical country will generate X amount of total carbon, but if you do it with mixed species and also maintains ecosystem services better and brings biodiversity better, more, that you'll receive an extra price for that carbon. Some of these initiatives, of course, this is all our work is on the voluntary market yet, but they are part of the voluntary market adding to this, because there is this push now to link biodiversity and climate. So it's nature and climate together, instead of saying I invest in biodiversity and then I invest in climate. We're trying to find a place, and this is one of them. And some of the financial system banks, etc., there is the TFT, the Financial Disclosure Task Force, Nature Disclosure Task Force of the financial banks, which are looking into how they can also report back on this, and this will create more of the market for attracting this. So instead of having a carbon bond and a green bond, let's have a bond that delivers more on everything. Some of the examples are out there. Some, if we can have payment for environmental services also better account for, I think there is a chance that can be an additional tool. It's not going to be a panacea, but it can be an additional tool.
Thank you, Garo. So we're now moving to the second part of this session, and we have invited some authors who have remarkable work in this area of forest contributions to SDGs through their different ecosystem services. So our first speaker in this module is here with us, Mr. Francisco Aguilar. He is a professor of forest economics in the Swedish University of Agricultural Science, and he will present the paper, his work on wood energy and the SDGs, value-added ecological resilience and carbon trade-offs. Francisco, please, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. It's very good to see all of you here and all of you who are joining us online. Today, it's really a real pleasure to be invited to be part of this session, such an important topic on Sustainable Development Goals. But I want to talk about the role that wood energy can have in advancing sustainability. Yeah. By definition, wood energy hits Sustainable Development Goal number 7, but it also cuts across many other SDGs. Today, I hope that I can make the case that wood energy, under the right conditions, can help advance those SDGs. It's often the case that wood energy is seen as a dirty and old-fashioned type of energy source. Indeed, it's one of the oldest sources of energy that we have as humanity. But my point today is that under some conditions, under the right conditions, we can make it a green pathway for wood energy. Starting with efficiency. On the upper left-hand side, you can think about traditional firewood systems, or not traditional, perhaps informal, that add value to that material. Just as other more industrialized systems, the lower left-hand side, where you have fibers are being densified pelletized with certified fibers being exported across the Atlantic. Both systems add value. Some of the differences that we have is that in the more informal one, there are a lot of inefficiencies, even to the point of the final energy conversion of combustion. Looking at the example of fireplaces, compared to a high efficiency heating system, a heating stove, a fireplace only generates 1/7 of what you would generate from the same amount of wood with a high efficiency system. These results in a lot of pollution. The inefficiency in combustion means that there are a lot of particulate emissions that affect the people that are using it, mostly women. So it has a really direct gender element. On an annual basis, at very least 1.5 million people die because of related illnesses. This is a very important issue, but it can be fixed. Efficiency, and efficiency comes also with integrated management, managing energy with other products that may carry more value. On the left-hand side is perhaps something that you might often see in the Global South. Stumps left behind, trees have been chopped down to turn it into charcoal. It should be a closed canopy, it's a national forest, yet it's not, it's been degraded. On the left-hand side, you have a system where actually timber products are harvested also with products to be used for energy. It's integrated, and it carries very important ecological objectives. We have to deal with a climate that is changing and invasive species that are becoming more prevalent. And when you have energy as a market, it creates a system where much of that biomass can be actually utilized instead of just being left behind and adding fuel loads in the forest. In 2020, in Sweden, as an example, we had about 8 million cubic meters of material that was dead, killed by spruce bark beetle. What was done with that material? Used into highly efficient combined heat and power systems to be turned into useful energy. We look at efficiency, we can minimize carbon trade-offs, and we have to look at that landscape. And in this case, we need to have incentives that really create a motivation to grow and regrow that biomass. In the Global South, that's often not the case because those incentives are just not there, starting with the legality of harvesting the biomass. We have many examples where we have land that has been leased, concessed, to harvest timber for export markets in many parts of the Global South. I think we can use a very similar blueprint to work with the local communities that need that energy. I think that is possible, and that is actually needed. I'm finalizing with the issue of livelihoods. This is not something that's limited to developing countries, the Global South, starting from the very Nordics. We go to a sauna and we bond as a family and friends. Wood energy is central to that. Back in the day, women will give birth in the sauna because it was the cleanest room in the household. In the global south, when you think about firewood and degradation, we're very quick to point fingers at those households, and I don't think that's the right approach anymore. Most often, the households that harvested wood illegally is because they're in a trap of energy. There's no alternative energy. And if you have to feed your family, you have to use the energy that's available. I would do the same if I have to feed my kids. So we have to rethink that mindset and look for ways that we can create incentives so that local communities can really be part of the solution in using wood as a sustainable source of energy. So with that, I would like to conclude. I think there is a green pathway for wood energy. I think it is possible. And really, to advance the Sustainable Development Goals, it's something that is needed. And I hope we can be part of that solution. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Francisco, for bringing the picture of wood energy to our session. I would like to invite now Duane Ruffman. He is the Vice President Forestry at SAPI, Southern Africa, member of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development Forest Solutions Group. Duane is going to bring us the private sector view through the presentation, the forest private sector contributions to sustainable landscapes, aligning forest production and ecosystem restoration. Duane is going to present remotely, please.
Thanks, Jess. Good evening, everybody, or good afternoon, everybody. I think very important, I'm just going to ask you to skip through to the next slide and the slide after that. The next one, thank you. I think it's very important to understand where SAPI fits in, and then I'll touch on the South African forestry and just to get a little bit of context, and then give you a simple example of how we tie sustainability goals into management and into our other strategies as an organization. I'll share with you an example of how we make it practical and how we drive socio-economic change in the rural landscapes in South Africa. So why does SAPI exist? The purpose for SAPI to exist is to build a thriving world by unlocking the power of renewable resources for the benefit of people, communities, and the planet. Next. We are a global-based company that originated in South Africa and have got manufacturing plants in Europe, in North America, and South Africa, and trade offices that serve 150 countries. We directly employ 12,000 people plus, and we've been in this business for quite a while. Next. I think the important thing is when we speak about unlocking the power of trees and natural resources, we talk around really utilizing the whole tree, from the cellulose, nanocellulose, getting into using the hemicellulose and the lignin across a wide spectrum of industries. And it touches everybody's lives every single day, not just in solid timber for construction of homes and roof trusses, but into clothing through our dissolving wood pulp business. And it also transitions into the biotechnical space where it becomes additives or chemicals into a lot of other processing industries, displacing a lot of fossil-based chemistry. I'm going to move over to the South African landscape very quickly. We can get to the next, please. So in South Africa, we are very limited with natural forests. And I think it's very important to understand that because of that, and if we look at the land distribution, the South African landscape had to do something to service the solid wood needs through its development period. And since the early 1900s, plantations and commercial forestry plantations, mostly pine and eucalyptus and acacia species, have been planted on degraded grasslands to really substitute that need for solid wood for development. And this has transitioned into a pulp and export businesses. I think it's very important to understand that the industry employs direct and indirect employment, 270,000 people, and really because of its small footprint, it still serves a very significant economic empowerment base in the industry or in the economy per se. You can go to the next. So just click through this one very quickly. South Africa, or SAPI Southern Africa, has got 10,000 people directly or indirectly or directly employed in the forestry landscape, specifically through 40 entrepreneurial businesses. The whole value chain in our business have been outsourced to small entrepreneurial businesses with a lot of focus on localization in the area where we grow our trees, and then transferring it through into our processing plants. We've got a very strong leg of research and development looking at tree and genetics, tree breeding. We have significant nursery capacity, and then really the employment phases really scale up through the rest of the value chain. And I think Paolo has done a brilliant job in explaining the distribution between economic value add and versus employment creation at the different phases of primary and secondary processing in the industry in Uruguay, and it's very similar in South Africa. You go to the next slide. I think the very important thing is that SAPI is adopted as an international company, quite a number of the SDGs with specific outcomes that is tied to not just these sustainability goals, but it is based on science-based targets, and it really filters down into the key objectives of every single employee in our organization, right from the board to the executives to every single forester, and even beyond that within our organization. We go to the next slide. I think it's very important to understand that there's a number of significant goals that is really on every single agenda point in our organization every single day. In the South African landscape, the focus has also added to the socioeconomic development side because of the past in South Africa and our focus on driving socioeconomic transformation in the country. Go to the next slide. Just to make it a little bit more real, we've got a lot of focus around social impact. And in the social impact strategy that we have, it really distills down not just to the community segment, but it covers partnerships, collaboration. It talks around and really puts out practical measures that drive thought leadership, inspiring and guiding government policy so that it is to the benefit of the people, but also to the benefit of the planet and South Africa and specifically. Go to the next slide from a practical reference point of view. On the social impact side, and I've tried linking some of these to the SDGs, but real serious focus around sustainable community income, real specific employment, and making sure that we also drive skills development throughout our communities and our local communities, with a lot of focus on the biodiversity and the water side as well. So it is not teaching people just about technical skills that they can go and apply in our industry, but which they can take home and really help building their local communities. But then also we use the opportunity to drive the understanding of sustainability and how forestry fits into the landscape as a key anchor tenant. And to make it practical, let's go on to the next slide, and I'll try and explain that very quickly. So one of our key projects that we started in the early 1980s is what we call our Caliso small grower schemes and small grower projects that really engages with people living on traditional land, and that does not necessarily have land ownership, but have full use of the land. And by empowering them to participate in the full value chain, from growing the trees to harvesting, setting up small contractor businesses as the landscape developed, all the way through to becoming key suppliers into our processing plants. And it has developed from 18 small growers in 1984 in that area to about 4,000 growers that now grows trees on about 35,000 hectares and supplies over 400 tons on a sustainable manner into our processing plants every single year. And I must say that it is really heartwarming when one goes into a rural landscape and the old lady explains how she has used commercial forestry to supplement her daily income out of subsistence farming, to put her children through school, into university, to build a new house and really set a legacy for a family. And there's some of these individuals that is now in their fourth rotation of tree crop, and the difference it makes in that rural landscape is quantifiable, and it is not just talk. So if we go to the next slide, I think in conclusion, I think it's very important to understand that in a natural forest constrained environment like South Africa, commercial forestry plantations has a key role to play not just to help improve degraded land and sequester carbon, but it also is a key and anchor tenant to drive the circular economy in a practical manner. And we can enable socioeconomic transformation because in the collaboration between commercial entities like SAPI, the commercial farmers who are our neighbors, and the local communities who are our neighbors, we can really put forestry at the heart of driving economic stability and transformation. And I think it is in that sense that we go to the concluding slide to say that if we want to create a thriving world, we really have to do it in a practical manner and transform the SDGs into strategy, into tactical actions that touches people's lives every single day. Because if people have got an emotional connection to trees, to nature, to the operating environment where commercial forestry operations are, it is only then that we can sustain a real thriving community to the benefit of the people, those communities, and to the planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Dwayne, for such an inspiring presentation and showing us how things take place, how we can have forest contributions from the private sector to the SDGs in a very comprehensive manner. Our next speaker will speak about the forest ecosystem services, so the different services that forests provide to us. And we're going to play his presentation. He is online, but he says he has an unstable internet connection at the moment. So Luke Brander. Luke Brander is a senior researcher of the Institute for Environmental Studies, and he will present the role of forest ecosystem services to support the green recovery, evidence from the Ecosystem Services Valuation Database. Please, Luke.
Good afternoon. My name is Luke Brander. I'm an environmental economist at the Institute for Environmental Studies at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. So first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to present at this session. My brief presentation is on evidence from the Ecosystem Services Valuation Database, the ESVD, on the role of forest ecosystem services to support the green recovery. So the Ecosystem Services Valuation Database, ESVD, is currently, to our knowledge, the largest global collection of value estimates for ecosystem services. Currently in total, covering all biomes, we have around or just over 7,000 value estimates in the ESVD. These are monetary estimates for the economic value of ecosystem services, covering the whole range of ecosystem services from provisioning, regulating, and cultural services. And this year we've been working on an update of the ESVD, specifically focused on forest values. And this has been part of work for the State of Forests report, SOFO 2022. So after this update, we've now increased the number of value estimates, information on forest ecosystem services, and we have over 2,700 value estimates for the economic value of forest ecosystem services. And this information covers all regions, forest types, and ecosystem services. And the map here on my screen shows the locations of study sites that have been valued and included in the ESVD. So covering all parts of the world. And what we tried to do is take this value information from studies in the literature and include them in the database and standardize those values where possible to a common set of units. And we use international dollars per hectare per year to allow comparability and summary of that value information. And this database is freely accessible to anybody through a web interface, which you can find at esvd.net. So I encourage you, please access the database and please feel free to use the data. So to say something more about forest ecosystem service values that we have in the ESVD, of course, some forest types are much better represented than others in the database. And the chart here on this slide shows the number of value estimates per forest type. So we have a lot of information from mangroves and tropical forests and temperate forests, and less information actually for other forest types, and particularly for plantations, forested peatlands, and forested wetlands. There's just relatively less information in the literature on those types of forests. What we also find from this review of forest ecosystem service value information is that forest values are highly variable, really as expected, and it really reflects differences in supply and demand and differences in the characteristics and context of different forests that have been valued and included in the database. We find very high values for some forest ecosystem services. For example, we find very high values for flood regulation provided by mangroves. On average, the data in the ESVD shows that the value of this service is in the order of 100,000 international dollars per hectare per year. We find even higher values for the service of recreation provided by urban forests, which is in the range of 280,000 international dollars per hectare per year. So very high values, but of course also quite variable. And this information on economic value of ecosystem services provided by forests is potentially useful for informing decision-making and guiding the greener recovery, particularly in terms of impact assessment. So using this information to assess the economic value of changes in forest ecosystem services when those forests are impacted, or in terms of appraising green investments in improved management or conservation of forests. What does that mean in terms of the enhanced value of forest ecosystem services? It can also be useful information for setting prices, so setting prices for payments for ecosystem services on forest ecosystem services, and also for designing sustainable finance mechanisms. Further, this information from the ESVD can be useful for natural capital accounting, so trying to highlight and increase our understanding of the value of forest ecosystem services at a national scale. And what we observe in the ESVD is that many of the forest ecosystem services are not marketed. So much of the value, a large proportion of the value of forests is not marketed and not visible in conventional accounts. And therefore, this kind of information is really crucial to making those non-market values visible. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luke. This is a very good overview of the forest ecosystem services. I would like now to invite Mr. Daniel Miller from the University of Notre Dame to present Forestry and Poverty, New Evidence on Forest Proximate People and Forest and Poverty Dynamics. Daniel is also presenting remotely.
Hello.
Thank you.
I'm Dan Miller, and it's my pleasure, on behalf of a number of colleagues listed here, to share with you our latest research on forestry and poverty. We begin with the premise that building knowledge on forest poverty dynamics is critical to better manage forests so that they can support a range of the Sustainable Development Goals, not least the first goal to eliminate extreme poverty. Our contribution is first to map the number of people living in or near forests globally, and then second is to synthesize available scientific evidence on how forests and trees affect poverty. We estimated the number of forest proximate people globally, and we first defined FPPs, forest proximate people, as humans that live in or near to forests. And this is an important dimension of how people might come to rely on forests. We use publicly available data on forest cover from the Copernicus Global Land Cover dataset, defined as any area of tree cover greater than 1 hectare. We combine that with human population density from the World Pop dataset. Our analysis concerns the year 2019 and was at 100-meter resolution. We basically combined these two data sets using Euclidean distance to create a 1 and 5 kilometer buffer zone around each forest cover pixel. We used Google Earth Engine to do our analysis. The top line result is that 95% of all people outside urban areas globally live within 5 kilometers of a forest in 2019. And you can see the darker the red or orange color, the more population lived within 5 kilometers of a forest, such as South Asia and India, here, China, but many other parts of the world had high proportions of forest proximate people. We did the same analysis, but of people living within 1 kilometer, and results were similar. We found 75% of all people outside urban areas live within 1 kilometer of a forest. And again, you can see the distribution globally. The vast majority of people living in or close to a forest were in low and middle income countries. This was 3.61 billion people, or 87% of the total, living within 5 kilometers, and a similar percentage living within 1 kilometer. This is important because an estimated 80% of the world's extreme poor live in rural areas of primarily low and middle income countries. And so there's likely a high correlation between forest proximity and extreme poverty. We compiled the latest scientific evidence on forest trees and the eradication of poverty through a report led by and supported by IUFRO. And some of the top line messages from that report are as follows. First, that forests and trees are critical to ending poverty. Forests contribute about 25% of household income in many tropical countries, and they provide a range of goods and services that can support human well-being, build assets that can enable people to move out of poverty, and manage risks across seasons and across years. Our second key message is that inadequate land use policies can lead to excessive costs being borne by the poor. So overexploitation of forests, such as seen here in Chile, can pose a serious threat to those that rely on them, particularly the poor. And that the poor are often not able to capture the bulk of benefits from forests. Our third message is more hopeful. And that is, we found that measures do exist to enable forests to address poverty goals. Some of the ones that were that had evidence supporting this contention are agroforestry, community forest management, and ecotourism, among others. But we caution there's no one-size-fits-all policy approach, and that decision makers will need to embrace complexity and take seriously potential trade-offs involved in different policy options. The key takeaways from this work are as follows. Many more people live in or near forests than is previously thought, and that many of the poor or near poor are living close to forests, and forests are vital for their livelihoods and well-being. And therefore, rural poverty alleviation and development must consider forests. Our results can help with the latest evidence to inform policy design, can help decision makers to target policies and develop estimates of the populations likely to be affected, and then contribute to the development of a global indicator on the number of forest-dependent people in extreme poverty for tracking change over time. I thank you for your attention, and I also thank those that have supported this research as listed below. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, for this overview of the relationship between forests and poverty. And we're now heading to the last presentation of this session, and hopefully we will have 5 minutes for some questions. I invite Ms. Zabaeta Ramshilovic-Suominen from the Natural Resource Institute in Finland. She will present on the socio-ecological justice in deforestation-free forest value chains and products. Zabaeta is also presenting remotely. Thank you.
Suominen, and I'm an associate research professor and Academy of Finland research fellow. I'm based at the Natural Resources Institute Finland, or LUKE. So I'll go straight to my talk, and I will start with why justice is important in international sustainable forest policy initiatives. SDGs, carbon trade, ecosystem services, landscape restoration, green economy, bioeconomy, REDD+, FLEGT, FSC, PEFC, various certification schemes, sustainable and deforestation-free value chains. What do these initiatives have in common? So, despite their differences, in all cases, there is a substantial gap, geographic, cultural, political, and economic gap, in terms of where, for whom, by whom, and why are they designed versus where, for whom, by whom they are implemented. So also, all of these initiatives and policies include local level measures. Of course, not only local ones, but they do all imply local interventions in terms of mitigation, adaptation, and in the case of forest value chains, in terms of production. So we are talking about policies designed and negotiated at international and national state levels. Yes. By international and state actors, plus global and domestic civil society, where such exist, of course, which are aiming at predominantly globally defined aims and objectives. Yet these policies are at least partly implemented at the village level by local communities who do not define the policy problems, solutions, or aims, but nonetheless continue to see their lifestyles and livelihoods changed and targeted. And remember, we are talking about the lifestyles and livelihoods of those among us who live most modestly. At the same time, the economies and lifestyles of those among us, others, who historically and currently are more responsible for the problems such initiatives aim to address, are hardly problematized at all. So, for example, the newly proposed EU regulation for deforestation-free value chains for cocoa, coffee, and a number of other commodities do not include direct policy measures to reduce overconsumption of those commodities by its population. Rather, they impose rules and demands on how these products should be, produced and delivered to the EU. So indeed, no international forest policy initiative, I would say ever, no matter its focus, aimed at addressing the lifestyles of the privileged, predominantly wealthy, and predominantly white communities and countries. And this implies that this kind of initiatives, by definition, offer fertile ground for various injustices, repression, and violence. As a result, environmental justice principles have been advocated for, to be included, to be considered, and also various environmental justice approaches have been proposed and developed. So now, let us move to the question of what environmental justice is, could be. So the movements and the literature on environmental justice has flourished since the late 70s, early 80s. And this is just a representation of the probably most used framework, also known as the three-dimensional environmental justice framework. It highlights three aspects as key dimensions of justice, including number one, procedure or procedural justice, which concerns participation and representation in decision-making. Number two, distributive justice, which is about equal distribution of burdens and benefits from an initiative or a project. And later on, recognitional justice was added, which is about respecting differences and identities from racial to gender, sexual, cultural, religious, etc., etc. So the framework suggests that as long as these three issues are, taken care of, satisfied, and addressed, justice is served. Now, this view is increasingly criticized by indigenous, decolonial, and other critical environmental justice scholars who argue that the framework, similarly to the policy interventions it is concerned with, is based on the Western Eurocentric epistemology and ontology, and also do not go beyond state authority and structures, and therefore, more often than not, do not fit the sociocultural and sociopolitical conditions in those places and those localities, local levels where it's applied. Actually, in fact, applying this framework on its own can act as a source of injustice, epistemic injustice, political denial, for example, and so on. So today I wanted to highlight another approach or perspective of environmental justice, and that is a colonial environmental justice framework, or DEJ for short. So that draws on the logic of decoloniality to feed into the field of environmental justice. What decoloniality is, we can touch upon in the discussion if needed, but it's also covered in those two references, so you can check out that if you're interested. In general, decolonial environmental justice is meant to allow for epistemologically different ideas and logics, philosophies of life, but also different political, legal and governing structures to coexist along with the dominant Eurocentric ideas and state-centric structures. So very quickly, and I invite you again to check out the references for more, what this means for environmental justice field is that number one, instead of distributional justice, that suggests the need for rethinking the idea of objectifying and distributing nature, and with that, rethinking the human nature duality as a whole. Then number two, instead of recognition and recognizing other cultures and identities, which is very important, but that goes beyond that and suggests the need for self-determination beyond the dominant conceptions of knowledge and the dominant authority. Number three, instead of participation within the kind of dominant state structures, it demands the right to self-governing authority, where, let's say, indigenous and other traditional authorities would have the right to govern their territories within their own governing and legal structures. This decolonial perspective offers a more holistic approach to justice that can accommodate, the reality of wider epistemic, ontological, and political realities and conceptions that exist out there, where international forest policy initiatives are widely.
Sorry to interrupt. Could we close? So apologies for that. I was told she was presenting live, and it seems she was not. Sorry for that. Yes, we are just reaching 5:30, and I know many of you have another meetings at 5:30. So we have time for one question at least. We have had, I think, a very broad overview of the different forest contributions to the SDGs, and more than that, some of the complex dynamics between forest and poverty, between the issues on how to include and how to ensure that communities are respected and that they are included in value chains with equity and their rights. We have also seen, the issues on wood energy and how wood energy is feasible, how it's something that can provide positive contributions if it's well managed and if it's managed in the context of the landscape. We have also learned more about the bioeconomy, and we had here, I think, two very good presentations on the bioeconomy and how it can integrate with local development, both from Uruguay, the case from Uruguay, but also how the private sector is tackling the SDGs very seriously and monitoring their performance and their activities against the different SDGs and quantifying these results. We have seen examples on how we can measure contributions from forests to livelihoods, in particular from the forest sector, the forest industry, and the forest ecosystem services. So it's a very broad overview on how we can not only what are these contributions, but also the efforts made to measure these contributions and allow them to be meaningfully considered in policymaking. So I don't see any question, and the time is running over. So I really would like to thank our panelists. I think it was a great panel. Thank the attendants to this session, and I hope you have a great week. And I think we have a lot all to learn together during this week. Thank you very much for staying with us.
Thank you.